Welcome to today's PDAC webinar, Going Green with Hydrogen, which is the second of our 16 sessions in the Fasken series. My name is Frank Mariage, and I am a partner in Fasken's Montreal office and a member of the PDAC program committee. This is Fasken's 11th annual PDAC seminar series. This year, we are doing it virtually, like PDAC itself, which starts a week from today. We have people joining us today from all over the world. We are also broadcasting this on YouTube Live and LinkedIn Live. Once again, welcome everyone. And now I will turn things over to Janet Howard, partner and co-founder of the firm's Hydrogen Energy Advisor Group and an energy and mining practitioner in our Toronto office. Janet, over to you.
My name is Janet Howard. I'm a partner here in Fasken's Toronto office, and I work with companies in the mining space, energy sector, and I'm also co-founder of the firm's Hydrogen Energy Practice Group, which is a group we formed specifically at the end of last year after spending about 2 years working with clients who are actively engaged in the hydrogen energy space. And we decided it made a lot of sense right now to put together a session for the mining industry on this topic, going green with hydrogen. It's such an exciting time in the industry right now. There's so much momentum and support behind a transition that's occurring in the energy sector that's directly relevant to the mining sector. And the focus of today's discussion will be on identifying the opportunities that are presenting, specifically those relating to hydrogen energy and hydrogen technologies. And helping us, we've got James Scongack from Bruce Power, Andrew Stewart from Hydrogen Optimized, and Jonathan Hackett from BMO. And professionals in the mining industry, our guests who are joining us here today. And in a minute, I'll get to proper introductions for our expert panelists. But if I can turn everybody's attention to the chat function in the platform that you're watching this on, please feel free to type your questions. They're going to pop up. I'm going to see the questions that are being asked. And what we'd really like to do today is make this session as interactive as possible. There's an opportunity here to ask questions from people who are actively engaged in the power production, the innovative technologies, and the sources of financing. And they're ready to answer questions that people have. So to set the stage, there's been so much discussion and concern centered around climate change and the impacts of global warming, catastrophic weather change. And I would suggest that the mining industry has been focused on this for the past decade or more. And I personally have got clients sending me the very standards that the industry was articulating and focused on long before others were even speaking about ESG. And I view this as an opportunity right now for the sector to lead. So what are the facts? In 2015, the Paris Climate Agreement called for a reduction of carbon emissions to net zero by 2050, ideally to limit global warming to below 2 degrees Celsius. And based on a report published by McKinsey and Company, mining is responsible for 4 to 7% of GHG emissions globally. And 1% of that total comes from Scope 1 and Scope 2 carbon emissions from mining operations and power consumption. And if anyone is interested in reading that report, it was published in January 2020, and it's called What Every Mining CEO Needs to Know. So the next question I have, what are mining companies doing in response? And I'd suggest there are two elements. The first is disclosure related. So there are large companies, mining companies, focused on setting ambitious targets, and they're putting these targets in their public disclosure documentation. Rio Tinto is one. They've set an ambition to reach net zero emissions by 2050, with 2030 targets to reduce emissions intensity by 30% and absolute emissions by 15%. We've got Anglo American committing to reduce GHG emissions by 30% by 2030, and they've set a target to achieve carbon neutrality across its operations, covering both Scope 1 and 2 before 2040. BHP similarly has set a target of net zero by 2050. Teck has jumped on board. They've set a goal of carbon neutrality across all operations by 2050. So the industry is leading. Ivanhoe has produced a sustainability report. A lot of the mining companies are starting to put out these sustainability reports. There's specific disclosure in theirs of GHG, greenhouse gas emissions, scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, how much is emitted from their operations. And in that disclosure, they're describing their strategy to reduce emissions, and there's specific reference to the integration of low emissions technology at their Kamoa-Kakula project in the DRC. So we see disclosure playing an important role in this. And then the second aspect, changes that are being implemented in the strategic direction and mining operations. And again, there's a list of examples. There are a lot of people in the industry talking about this, as those on this call can appreciate. BHP, Fortescue, Anglo American, and Hatch have formed the Green Hydrogen Consortium in March 2020, pledging to accelerate renewable energy, powered hydrogen production and its application to the resources sector. And you have Anglo American and Williams Advanced Engineering working to develop the world's largest hydrogen-powered haul truck. In Chile, Cicero Chile, Engie, and Mining 3 are working on the Hydra project to reduce 100% of GHG emissions from mining vehicles. And at the end of last year, December 20, Robert Friedland announced a US SPAC, Ivanhoe Capital Acquisition Corp., with a target to raise $200 million to invest in companies supporting the energy transition and this paradigm shift away from fossil fuels. So focusing in, why are we here today? The hope is not to focus this conversation on flagging the fact that an energy transition is underway. It directly impacts the business of mining, it's happening, and the people on this call already know about it. It's not intended to focus on ESG and whether it's relevant to your business. The people on this call already appreciate that it is relevant to the business. It's intended to be a practical, interactive discussion with industry experts working in the fields of power generation, innovative technologies, and financing to help navigate how mining companies can position their operations to maximize the benefits and capitalize on the opportunities that are presenting. So I'm very excited to see what I see happening. And I'd like to turn things over and introduce our panelists. First, we've got James Scongack, who's the Executive Vice President of Corporate Affairs and Operational Services at Bruce Power. And just to whet the appetites, Bruce Power launched a net zero 2050 hydrogen strategy in October 2020. It sets out certain activities to be carried out at the Bruce Power Center for Next Generation Nuclear, including a hydrogen unity project. And Bruce's strategy also includes reference to grid-scale SMRs, small modular reactors, which can be between 50 and 300 megawatts of emissions-free electricity. It can power between 50 and 300 megawatts of emission-free electricity. And Bruce has also announced that its Center for Next Generation Nuclear will evaluate mass production of hydrogen using technology. And next, we've got Andrew Stewart, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Hydrogen Optimized. And Andrew's a fourth-generation Canadian hydrogen entrepreneur and engineer, specifically focused on the production of green hydrogen through the process of electrolysis. And his company is focused on providing a large-scale electrolyzer to end users that can scale. And we have Jonathan Hackett, who's the Managing Director and Head of Sustainable Finance at BMO Financial Group. BMO's announced a commitment to mobilize $400 billion for sustainable finance and has created a $250 million impact investment fund to fund and scale solutions to the sustainability problem. So gentlemen, welcome, and thank you very much for your participation today. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to James, who I believe will be speaking to decarbonization and reducing emissions to net zero by 2050. James.
Great, thanks very much for the introduction, and really appreciate you having me, and also to Faskens for putting on today's session. I think this is obviously a really timely and important conversation. You know, and in particular, as we hope we're at the end of the tunnel here on COVID-19 with vaccines, more and more vaccines being approved and arriving. There's obviously a more significant dialogue going on about, what does economic recovery recovery after the pandemic look like? And in particular, what does a green economic recovery look like? Before I get into hydrogen specifically, what I thought I'd maybe do is anchor the conversation in a number of points that I think are helpful. The first is that in 2020, myself and a group of organizations, business organizations, environmental organizations, post-secondary institutions, formed an organization called the Green Ribbon Panel. This was obviously launched before the pandemic, but we did continue our work in 2020. And really what the purpose of this Green Ribbon Panel, and you can go to the website, it's greenribbonpanel.ca. And the purpose of this, the Green Ribbon Panel, was to look at what are some practical and executable solutions in the fight against climate change. And the intention of this was not to be what I would call an earth-shattering report. It was really to be very practical and look at a series of what I would call step-by-step leveraging existing technologies and really anchoring on the various elements that we know we can count on. And through the Green Ribbon Panel discussion, and you'll see this in the report, we talked actually quite a bit about hydrogen. And there were really two things that jumped out from a hydrogen perspective that I think are really helpful to contribute to the discussion today before I specifically talk about nuclear's role in that. The first is we had a debate as a Green Ribbon Panel about, is it blue hydrogen? Is it green hydrogen? Is it gray hydrogen? And at the end of the day, I always like to say to people, hydrogen is hydrogen. And one of the things the Green Ribbon Panel concluded was that, and it really ties into the point that was made in the introduction, hydrogen has the opportunity of being a source of energy that can be unifying. And the general conclusion the Green Ribbon Panel made at the time was that in the vast overwhelming majority of cases where hydrogen could be used, you can argue whatever color hydrogen is, but in the overwhelming majority of cases, the application of hydrogen was an improvement from where we are today. And so that really, is going to kind of be the underscoring of the message from my perspective, which is, we are talking about a really long time horizon in terms of energy innovation and some of these other things, but it's also important to be very practical and executable in the short term. And that really leads me to the vantage point that I come at with, which is from the Bruce Power site. As was noted, we operate the world's largest operating nuclear facility in rural southwestern Ontario. We generate about a third of Ontario's electricity through 8 reactors. We're also a global leader and supplier of medical isotopes, and in particular during the pandemic, we've been a supplier of medical isotopes used in the sterilization of medical equipment, whether it's COVID swabs, whether it's gloves, and even some materials being used in vaccine development right now. So we're a well-situated company that has currently a very strong defined role. And as home to one of Canada's largest infrastructure projects, we plan to play that role through 2064. So the first thing I'll say is, before we talk about new technologies, new forms of energy, I think one of the most important things, and this is what I always remind people when we're talking about energy or electricity here in Ontario, is throughout Canada, and Ontario is no exception to that, the Bruce is included in that, the use of existing assets is a very important first place to start. We do know as Canadians, for better or for worse, how challenging it is to site new infrastructure. And that, there is no type of, sometimes the media suggests that's unique to pipelines, but you can pick up the newspaper and, you get the same in nuclear, you get the same in hydroelectric, you get the same in transmission and distribution, you get the same in where you build public transit. In our modern society today, there tends to be a significant amount of opposition to any new infrastructure. And so what I think is really important is that leads us to a natural conclusion that as we're thinking about where we need to go, we need to really take advantage and leverage the existing assets we have. And that's where I always start our conversation with Bruce Power. There's so many things we can leverage this asset for, and we're going to talk about hydrogen in a second. but its core focus as a site has to be the successful life extension program that is underway right now, the continued industry-leading reliable operations. And if we do those things well, and I think we do that across the entire electricity sector, all of our existing assets, it's going to give us a lot of other options. As was noted earlier, in October of last year, our President and CEO, Mike Renchuk, released what we called our NZ 2050 strategy. And really what that was about was looking at the fact that it's very clear at the federal level and the international level, there's a real move to net zero by 2050. And so this policy position really came out on the basis of what is it our organization is going to do to contribute to a net zero Canada by 2050. And it was really all anchored in that existing asset of electricity generation that we are in today. Bruce Power is not saying we're going to go build small modular reactors tomorrow, or we're going to be doing hydrogen projects tomorrow. What we're saying is that we believe this foundational asset that we have here on site, combined with the work that was noted in the introduction around the next generation nuclear center we launched, we believe this strong foundation of infrastructure will open up opportunities, maybe for Bruce Power, likely for many others, that can leverage this asset and our role in the province to do so many other things. So in my final couple of minutes here, I want to talk a bit about how hydrogen fits potentially in with that. We have a very decarbonized electricity system here in Ontario. We're more decarbonized than Germany. We're more decarbonized than California, and actually have lower prices. So one of the things I always like to say as a proud Canadian that lives in Ontario is a lot of people like to come to Canada and say how well countries like Germany and California are doing. These are countries that have shut down their nuclear plants and increased their fossil fuels. And that is no recipe to run an electricity system, nor is it a recipe for the future. By building on a strong decarbonized electricity system in Ontario, we fundamentally believe that can lead to a lot of other decarbonization opportunities. That can lead to electrification of vehicles, but also hydrogen production through electrolysis or other means. So, the key contribution that I would really like to make to this panel is really threefold before I pass it on to the next speaker for today's discussion. The first is let's not forget about the core. The core is really important. We have a lot of existing assets in this country, and we need to figure out how we optimize them all, because our energy demand is not going to go down. It is only going to go up, whether that is domestically or internationally. Principle 2 is we will only be able to advance solutions if we can develop solutions that are unifying and that everybody can buy into. You know what? I may be from the province of Ontario, but I'm a Canadian first. And I want to see my friends and colleagues in Alberta, and in particular, you think of a company like TC Energy, they are a massive investor in Bruce Power. We could not do what we are doing without the support of TC Energy, whether that's in our infrastructure program, our clean electricity, our medical isotopes. We couldn't do what we're doing without them. It's also important that companies like TC Energy and their other lines of business in the oil and gas, and what I call a modern oil and gas business, are successful. And so this is all about how do we secure that foundation and how do we continue to optimize. And that's really what I think hydrogen has the opportunity to do. Hydrogen is not a magic bullet. Anybody that tells you any technology is a magic bullet is not being honest, because there is no magic bullet. If there was, we wouldn't be having this conversation. We'd be winning in the fight against climate change, whereas I would argue around the world, because of some of the short-sighted decisions that have been made in other jurisdictions, we're not leading. There is no silver bullet. There's a series of tools in the toolbox, and we need to figure out how all of those fit together. I always like to say we shouldn't idolize or demonize any electricity source. It was once said, a lot of people refer to Canada as an energy superpower, and I agree with that. Part of being an energy superpower is a modern and successful oil and gas sector. It's a modern and successful nuclear sector, and it's a modern and successful hydroelectric sector. And I think with all three of those elements of our energy economy and energy sector strong, it's really going to position Canada at the leading edge in terms of leveraging other types of technologies, whether it's hydrogen and electrification. So I'm really looking forward in the panel discussion to talking more specifically about hydrogen. But I thought those foundational comments would be a good place to start today. Thanks for having me.
Thanks very much, James, for that. Just to provide a little bit of context before we turn it over to Andrew, some of the things that I was very interested in hearing you articulate the focus on the core assets that already exist in Ontario and in Canada. There are several callers from abroad who've dialed in. Mining, by its nature, is an international industry. And often companies will be listed on the North American exchanges. Money will be flowing in as a result of those listings to finance operations that are conducted abroad. And something that's occurred to me in discussions I've been having with people who are focused on the industry, it's a question of the export opportunities. So which of the countries where the hydrogen fuel will come from? Where will the new technologies and equipment come from? Is this going to pan out in terms of having hydrogen fuel be transported to site where operations have been converted over to using hydrogen power? Does that make sense? Is it the export of technology that can be installed in those mining operations abroad? Or is it the expertise, the familiarity, the track record, safety, the requirements that get implemented in certain situations? There'll be opportunities to build those projects abroad in a way that potentially ticks all of the boxes, the way the Canadians have been doing it for a while in terms of the safety standards and the safety record that exists here in the nuclear industry. Those are just some of the things that come to my mind in terms of listening to you speak and finding the ways in which those comments are, I think, relevant to the audience. And if we can turn it over to Andrew, Andrew's here to talk about using hydrogen technology to get to net zero, but in terms of what the technology can do for the people on the line, electricity can be used to produce hydrogen through a process called electrolysis. So if you have electricity from a nuclear plant, for example, it produces this electricity, and Andrew's got a way where you can use that electricity to produce hydrogen from the electrolysis process. Andrew, should we turn over to your slides now? Turn it over to your slides.
Yeah, thank you, Janet. And thank you very much for inviting me to speak at this quite prestigious panel and wonderful conference. I just was looking at the attendee list, I think, for this session, and there's about 450 people or so out there. So that's terrific. And good work for Fasken for setting this up. Now, can we move to the next slide? Great. So what I'm going to focus on, my first step is to communicate what is green hydrogen. Well, generally, there's all sorts of small deviations from that, but if you first need to understand the process of water electrolysis. Water electrolysis is something you probably all have heard of, where you put a direct current electricity flow into a device called a water electrolyzer, and that separates water into its two constituents of hydrogen and oxygen. Now, to make green hydrogen, you need to put electricity in that doesn't emit carbon sources. So it could be nuclear, solar, wind, hydro, tidal, many, many things like this. And the hydrogen then has a footprint that lacks any significant amount of carbon in it. And but there's also other ways to make hydrogen. And those ways include, which is the vast majority of the world's hydrogen today, starts with carbon sources, typically methane, or where you do something called steam methane reforming, or there's also a coking process or a partial oxidation type process. And these sources that start with fossil energy end up with CO2 emissions. And that, if you let the CO2 go to the atmosphere, that's termed gray hydrogen, or in some cases, brown hydrogen. And then this will not get us close to any kind of carbon neutrality. It's probably better in most cases to use the fossil energy directly in various industrial and chemical processes. So there could be some roles for the hydrogen, but it's really not helping achieving the net CO2 emissions or carbon neutrality. Now, there is blue hydrogen, and blue hydrogen is an interesting characteristic. If you take that gray hydrogen, but you capture the carbon dioxide, and if you sequester it underground, and so the carbon dioxide doesn't go into the atmosphere, then that is quite an interesting way of doing things. But you have to store the carbon dioxide to separate the hydrogen and the carbon dioxide during the production process. Then you have to store the carbon dioxide underground, and you can never get 100% of it. There are leaks and things like that. So this is not going to achieve net zero emissions, but frankly, going back to what James is saying, there's a lot of existing hydrogen out there from natural gas, and one can look at that infrastructure and consider a way of adapting it to create blue hydrogen. And blue hydrogen is a transition really to the final processes of making green hydrogen. So a lot will depend on where one is with hydrogen. If you've already got a gray hydrogen, it might transition to blue hydrogen. If you're not making hydrogen at all, you'll probably think green hydrogen is the way to go because it really gets you to the end goal. But we can talk about that later. Electrolysis is shown in that photograph. It's an alkaline electrolyzer. You're just separating water into hydrogen and oxygen through an electrochemical device. And that's what our company focuses on. But we focus on very large scale devices in the hundreds of megawatts. Okay, could we have the next slide? Now, this one, I think we're going to have to thumb our way through it, but I think the green electricity can be used a lot directly. And whenever you can use green electricity directly and avoid making hydrogen, I think that's a great idea. If you can use electricity, charge batteries, if those can drive motors, that's wonderful. But there's an issue here. They don't really work well for industrial processes. You can't use a solar panel and a battery to make ammonia fertilizer. You can't use solar panel and a battery very well to reduce iron ore to iron. And solar panels are very limited in heavy industrial applications. And from what we see, or what we're kind of learning about, and I think the world's learning about this, is that to really achieve carbon neutrality, there's about 25% to 40% of the world's fossil energy will need to be replaced by green or blue hydrogen. And that's a very big amount. And I think what's happened in the last year to 2 years, the realization of the size of this requirement for green electricity to make green hydrogen is just becoming aware. And we're seeing tremendous investment and advances in technology in the industry. And so this is the bridge between green electricity to the industrial users of fossil energy and how they can be changed. So really, if we go to the next slide, we're going to see kind of how we see where the world is going to be. Oh yeah, I'm sorry, just we've got water electrolysis really in the hundreds of gigawatts that are going to be required to do this. And we're looking at big applications, really big energy, not just buses and cars, but mining vehicles. A mining vehicle is like 10 or more buses, and the chemical plants that make ammonia, methanol, hydrogen for fossil fuel upgrading, and major transportation systems like ships and trains and one-day aircraft and very heavy-duty type transport. Again, we can talk later about where batteries fit in and where hydrogen fits in, but that gives you kind of the picture. So really what we see here as a company, how we see the world is green electricity attaches to these industrial, chemical, and utility applications, and it transforms those into sustainable energy use, whether that energy is chemical for making, say, ammonia, green ammonia, where you don't use natural gas to make your ammonia, but use green hydrogen from wind turbines or nuclear or solar panels or hydro, and you then make hydrogen, which has no or low, very low carbon footprint. In the case of the mining industry, you can see there's a roughly, I think, around a 250-ton mining vehicle where could be fuel cells. They're wonderful. They're coming out and hydrogen fed. Well, the business model is really interesting here because these potentially autonomous vehicles will have regular fueling systems and timing. It's a rather planned infrastructure. And with hydrogen storage buffers, it can be quite economic. It's a far better business model than bus or car filling stations. And that regular known filling infrastructure and timing does help a lot on the economics. So really, our company focuses on to be the bridge between green electricity and the industrial chemicals. So let's hit the button one more time and let's see what pops up. So what we do is convert green electricity to green hydrogen. But more importantly, in a lot of ways, we can convert industries which are sustainability laggards into ESG leaders. And our company goal is to be the first to get to about 10 gigawatts of water electrolysis because we're focused on very large scale. Just to give you some examples of scale, a green ammonia plant would need 1,000 megawatts, a gigawatt, in order to make enough hydrogen. A large mining vehicle might take 1.5 megawatts of renewable energy to make the hydrogen to support it, and there may be 100 of those vehicles at a large mine, maybe 50, maybe 200, but you can see you take 1.5 megawatts times the number of vehicles you're supporting, and that gives you a fairly large amount of green electricity to make green hydrogen. And so this is a new market. Our approach is with a new product designed to fit at that large scale. Let's see what the next slide says. So if you're looking at the mining industry, really important things to think about is the world's indigenous energy resources. They're the wind, the sun, the water, the tidal, but the wind and sun are ubiquitous in the world, which really means you actually can produce the green hydrogen everywhere. Some places will be better than other places, but it really is green electricity anywhere for everyone, including the mining industry. And what's changed a great deal is the cost of green electricity production, particularly with solar and wind. They've moved from being the most expensive forms of electricity 20, 25 years ago to being actually the lowest cost and most deployable. And that combined with low-cost water electrolysis equipment, cost at the mine site could be equivalent to LNG cost or cheaper than diesel transported in the mining site, because you can make this stuff at the mine site. Hydrogen also can buffer the renewable energy supply from its peaks and valleys. And if you look at that business model of fueling those large mining vehicles, it's a really tremendous, it's a very high value application for hydrogen, and it looks very attractive. But you can get, what this does to the greatest extent possible is you start to take the carbon out of the mining process. It really now you're a green mining company, and you're now selling green products. You've got green ores, you've got green iron ore, you've got a product of superior value in a carbon constraining world. And this opens up tremendous new opportunities with your clients. Because someone may want to buy, say, green iron ore because they want to make green steel, and they want to sell that green steel to car companies that want to actually have green cars, including not just the nature of how they're transported, but how they are manufactured. And this is sort of things you need to open your mind up and really start to see how the dynamics of a green mining industry can play to the world. And the opportunity is to get higher value and create cut opportunities for your customers. And that's really these new business models. One of the ones I fully support what James says is we need to get every electron and every element of resource from our existing assets. But it's very important to understand we're going to have to also build tremendous new capacity of green electricity everywhere. And this changes the business model of green electricity. Frankly, what you end up getting is you don't necessarily need a grid at some of these places. You might have a microgrid aggregating electricity that's been installed for the sole purpose of making green hydrogen. You actually don't need the electrical authorities. You don't need any of the interfaces. You need a microgrid or making hydrogen, and then you need maybe a hydrogen pipeline, which are quite simple. That might go 5 miles or 10 miles, a micro pipeline. And you can do much longer pipelines, of course, as well. But it really changes. It allows the mining industry to rethink and see what their opportunities are from a energy environmental footprint situation. And this enables that large-scale distributed hydrogen at site. My background in hydrogen, as Janet says, goes back many, many years, decades, and really we see things differently. We often talk about historically a large centralized production of something, and then you distribute that something to users. Then with one of the beauties of hydrogen is you can locally produce it, and that makes great sense historically for vehicle filling, making forklifts and other things. But what we see is a whole new market. We call this very large scale distributed. Make it where you need it and get rid of the infrastructure costs, reduce the storage as much as you can. And it's a different business model. And I think one of the things to think about is if your company's not using gray hydrogen today, there's really perhaps not a logical pathway to go to blue hydrogen unless, everything's a bit circumstantial. So going directly to green hydrogen really can be better. And
Andrew,
yeah?
Can I just interject too? Just in the interest of time, that is a very good summary of green hydrogen electrolysis. And there'll be a section of this presentation where we can draw a distinction between green hydrogen and blue hydrogen. And I know the audience is going to be very much interested in your commentary there. On the point you made with respect to make it where you need it, can we turn the discussion over to Jonathan from BMO, who's here to speak to the financing of these projects? And there's a concept he's going to be able to shed some light on in terms of transitionary financing to help mining companies get to net zero by integrating some of this new technology into their operations. Jonathan, shall we turn it over to you?
Sure. So thanks, Janet. I think it's interesting, seeing the lines that Andrew is drawing out. I really do think he touched on a few of the key things that I think about within the world of sustainable finance. One is, your footprint as a company, how people perceive you. You mentioned the how well acquainted mining is generally with ESG risk and the way that they approached that for years before the words ESG became kind of commonplace. And I think, that the energy transition is a great example within that. There's very much a question around your environmental footprint for investors and them thinking about it as the E within ESG. I think, Andrew, you also touched on a really great point, though, which is there's the risk and the view that investors might have of your operations and your contribution towards the climate. But more so, we've focused in my practice on how do we help our clients get paid for the value they create for their downstream users. This is something where, if you think about, as you were saying, people that are concerned with the carbon footprint of their end product, the ability to have a differentiated commodity really is a concept that we see coming into the market where you can get paid, whether it's actually on a differential price or even just on, preferential offtake agreements and the ability to secure those from high quality counterparties. When you have a differentiated commodity, obviously not in terms of atomic structure, iron is iron, But in terms of the carbon footprint and the history of that product and how you've extracted it, that's something where we see, opportunity for companies to be able to get benefit from a different environmental approach. The last piece, though, where I spend a good deal of my time is, as Janet called out, the idea of labeled financing. And this is the concept of, people talk about green, people talk about blue, people talk about gray. In my world, green financing has a very specific meaning, and that's projects that qualify under a set of taxonomies or a set of standards, or use of proceeds that we can take an existing financial product and potentially attract differential fixed income investors, or attract different participants at different rates based on the fact that it meets this taxonomy of a green product. And so generally, you would say, well, installing renewable power, that's something that's green. Nuclear power is something that we would call green. The concept within hydrogen, though, gets a bit more mixed. You can talk about, is hydrogen part of a green solution? But often it's being used for things that are not necessarily green applications. Industrial, manufacturing, or use within, extractive industries like mining can sometimes have investors or have participants in a market questioning, is this something that we can call green? And that's where this label of transition has really come to the forefront. The concept of having a financial labeling, or a label that's used within the financial markets, that indicates that something is making advancements towards a net zero economy, even if it itself is not an inherently green practice. And this is where blue hydrogen is a great example, or hydrogen conversion of something that may be, integral to the, future energy transition. If you think about mining, it's providing the materials that we need in order to have an energy transition. You can't get there without copper. You can't get there without uranium. You can't get there without cobalt and nickel, and all of these commodities that you need. But we want to do them in a way that is of a lower carbon footprint. And so the transition to hydrogen, or the transition over to a green economy, and making those changes that will reduce the environmental impact of those operations today, those are all getting put under a labeling of transition. And all of these things generally look and feel like normal financing. I always like to say people haven't lost their minds. It's not that you can come in and say, well, this is green, and people just throw money at it. But what does happen is there are increased pressures, whether it's in banks, whether it's in investors, whether it's asset managers, to deploy their assets in things that satisfy these labels. And so often it means that you can attract more participants into a syndication, that you can get people that are willing to make concessions on near-term pricing or immediate pricing because they believe that these investments will have secondary benefits from them, whether it's literally trading on secondaries for bonds, or whether it's their ability to attract more capital in the future with credentials and the same scrutiny that, just as corporates are under scrutiny for their ESG footprint, investors are under increased scrutiny for their ESG credentials and their ability to demonstrate the alignment of what they've done. And so if you think to, a hydrogen transition within the mining industry, it's a great example of something where, maybe electrification at whole scale is not possible for every operation, but the ability to move incrementally, to sources that will reduce your carbon emissions, to convert things over, is a way of furnishing the credentials, bringing to the forefront what is being done on reducing the footprint of your operations, and potentially attracting differential capital in the process.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Very helpful comments. Right now, we should move into the roundtable discussion. If there are questions that anybody listening would like posed to the panelists, just let me know. We've received a few already, and we can definitely work through them. I'd like to turn back to Andrew if I could. I think that it would be helpful to spend just a little bit more time on the difference between blue and green hydrogen, but not so much from the perspective of what the differences mean. I think that's been explained. And just to summarize, green hydrogen is produced when you're using green electricity to make it through this process of electrolysis. And I'll invite James into the conversation too, because James is well positioned to comment on whether or not nuclear has something to contribute to the production of green hydrogen? I would suggest using Andrew's definition, it very much does, green electricity. So in the first instance, we're seeing a lot of interest in mining companies and investors considering whether you can be building new infrastructure, which again, to James's point, is potentially not something in the long term that makes a lot of economic sense, but you've got to start somewhere, using solar panels, wind turbines, hydro facilities. There are projects around the world where you see strategic partnerships forming for the purposes of producing the hydrogen from renewable sources through electrolysis. So in the end, you've got the fuel that you can use. So Andrew, back to you in terms of something you had mentioned. You'd said in some places are better than others for producing green hydrogen. And the audience, I know in the mining community, there's focus on whether or not blue hydrogen is a viable alternative to green. And just to flag, blue hydrogen, you can create it through natural gas. So natural gas can be used to generate blue hydrogen through the process, steam, methane, reformation, as long as you sequester the carbon that's emitted from that process. And you've got an audience that is in an industry where there's some comfort that's developed in terms of storing dangerous gases. When mining is complete, you've got empty salt caverns that could be a very viable alternative for the purposes of storing the carbon. And mining companies are looking at these sequestration technologies. So Andrew, back to your comment, some places are better than others for the production of green hydrogen. What are the attributes that make some locations better for green versus blue?
Well, thank you, Janet. I think everything in life is site specific. If you've got no source of natural gas or a fossil form like coal, or you're very expensive to bring naphtha or diesel in, then the green has a tremendous appeal, particularly if you're in an area with good wind or sun. Mining is very distributed around the world, let alone if you have some hydro handy. Then mining can be quite attractive to use green hydrogen. If you're able to transport in natural gas, which is probably the process I see that makes the best choice of blue hydrogen versus a partial oxidation of a coal and that sort of gasification, which is a big capital investment indeed, then you certainly consider underground storage. You need to remember you need to create the storage as you're creating the hydrogen. It's sort of, if you create the storage after you've completed the mine, well, the CO2 is emitted to the air. You have to look at simultaneously making hydrogen and then storing the CO2. And I leave that to the mining experts, but don't forget that. And so I think the other question is, in general, the economics. When you add the cost of storage of carbon dioxide and also the cost to produce hydrogen, which segregates the CO2 and the hydrogen, and segregates it well enough that you're not really putting a lot of the CO2 up to the atmosphere. There's going to be some. It's a complete legitimate idea to consider using the empty mine space, but the empty mine space has to be empty. And so I think those are kind of the issues. Our view is that green hydrogen in most locations is going to be very economic to blue hydrogen at the end of the day. And we're not convinced there's a benefit to blue, but I honestly think it's a site-specific, company-specific situation. My only comment is generally the blue hydrogen is a transition to green hydrogen. I think the concern one might have is your assets get stranded using blue, and the green is very the way to go in the longer run, and the economics of green will only get better and better. I'm not sure if there's going to be improvements to the economics of blue hydrogen. I could be wrong, but I'm not sure.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Andrew. That's helpful input. And James, just to carry through something you had mentioned in your introductory comments when you were flagging hydrogen is hydrogen, and I think that's a fair comment. When the focus is on decarbonization and reducing emissions, does it really make a difference if there are opportunities for green versus blue? Potentially not. But something that I see developing when mining companies are put to the task of articulating in continuous disclosure documents the extent to which their greenhouse gas emissions have been reduced through the integration of technology into their operations, focus will be put on how that hydrogen was produced. Did it come from renewable energy? Did it come from green electricity? So if there is electricity being produced from a nuclear power plant or from technology that's being developed by the nuclear industry, I think it's fair to say attention later might be put towards whether that hydrogen is causing the greatest reduction in carbon emissions as possible. Do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the challenge with some of these topics is it can turn into a very sort of academic and philosophical conversation, and I'm not minimizing the conversation by saying that. I think it's a very real challenge, and sometimes from my perspective, I think what happens is that we miss the boat. You know, we if you take a step back and you think about, I often hear a lot about this dynamic of, well, if hydrogen is produced through electrolysis from nuclear, well, is it green? I mean, at the end of the day, if you take a look in practice of what happened in the province of Ontario, we were only able to phase out coal in Ontario because of the expansion and restart of our nuclear fleet. If you look at the federal government's plan, they say there's no strategy to a net zero Canada without nuclear power. So, at some point we need to stop letting perfection be the enemy of the good and just move forward. I think, this is the debate we get into in so many fronts, and that's where we need to, again, in the Green Ribbon panel, try to do this as best we could, which was, let's be very practical. What are steps 1 through 10? Often what happens in this debate, because it's such a massive area of policy, we're debating steps 47 through 128, and we haven't done 1 through 20. And that's always the concern that I have, and that some of these dynamics in terms of how people want to classify or rate things, it actually just, the final result is just inaction, right? If I look at, for example, you look at some of the work that TC Energy even did on the Keystone XL pipeline, coming out and saying that would be a net zero pipeline with renewable energy. I mean, there's one of the most progressive kind of projects you could see out there that would create jobs, a modern pipeline. Let's be honest, folks are going to still use that energy. Now, I don't want to talk about TC Energy's project. They're one of our owners. I'll leave that to them on that. But they're just really good examples of where sometimes we let this become a philosophical debate. And honestly, that happens with nuclear power as well. Is nuclear power a perfect form of electricity? No, it's not. But I'll tell you, there's no form of energy that's perfect. And so really what we have to try our best to do is be as smart and intelligent as we can and find out what that right mix is. If I can tell you right now, if we could power our entire economy off wind and solar, we would not be splitting atoms at the Bruce Power site. Right. And it's not to knock wind and solar, we just wouldn't. And so that's just about that realistic debate. And the truth is we need it all. And we need to get moving on it all, because every day we're debating and not putting shovels in the ground on these modern infrastructure projects is another day where we're actually falling further behind. And make no mistake about it, the rest of the world will provide us that energy, and they will not be as concerned on some of these nuances as we are.
Those are very fair points, James. Thank you for making them. And just on the same topic, to cover it off, green versus blue, Jonathan, from the perspective of de-risking, so when financing is available, something you've focused on in conversations we've had, you look very carefully in terms of what is a bankable project, and you look for the integration, the collaboration amongst strategic partners that present the greatest benefit to de-risk that project. From your perspective, does it make a difference whether mining companies are proceeding down the path towards green versus blue?
So it's interesting because in that kind of construct, the real answer is that the mining companies are, the recipients of that product. And so they become what you can finance via for those individual projects because they're the off-taker. They're the person that needs that material. And so in the end, blue versus green doesn't make a material difference. The only question is the stability of that output and the ability to have a consistent user of that. I think to that end, what both James and Andrew have been touching on is really important, which is the idea of large-scale conversion. That, if we think about where we need to go to electrify the economy, I do aside on the view that we need to make those investments that will actually allow us to electrify. And blue hydrogen is a great example along the way. For all that green, it would be better, whether it's from renewable or from nuclear power. That's one where the ability to have people that are actually creating the end uses will put the infrastructure in place so that we have an ability to shift more of the economy away from those emitting sources. The ability to use sequestration in the meantime, I agree, it may be difficult at an individual mine site. The one that comes as a reasonable example to me is within Alberta, there's the potential to have scaled blue hydrogen through the ACTL. So the ability to use the Alberta Carbon Trunk Line and to have people taking advantage of scaled sequestration through it means that we could actually convert more supply in a central sense to blue hydrogen. But all of these things really help us with what I think is the underlying problem, which is we need a lot more electricity. If we're going to electrify everything, hydrogen becomes a bridge in that situation to allow us to have energy density in fuels, to allow us to convert potentially some fossil fuels through sequestration into another usable form that doesn't have point source emissions at the end of the day, because you're really having that final step of energy use in a way that produces water rather than producing carbon dioxide. And so to some extent, it wouldn't change on the financing side as long as you have credit quality at the end user, whether from the miners that are actually going to use it, that are able to lend that through a contractual agreement to something that allows you to finance the operations.
Thank you, Jonathan. Moving the discussion over to another topic, reducing cost is something that I think is important to the people listening in terms of thinking through whether or not to integrate some of these new technologies and actually adapt their operations to integrate them. Something that comes up a lot, hydrogen is more expensive than diesel. Is that really the case in some remote locations where electricity and diesel is very expensive? It's expensive because the grid infrastructure is not built out. There are lots of mining operations that are conducted in fly-in zones. Is there something that can be done to further reduce the cost of hydrogen so that it's competitive with diesel, or what's the general view in terms of whether it actually is a cost competitive alternative right now to current sources of power? Andrew, is that something you have some views to share on?
Sure, Janet. Again, everything is site specific. But mining's a great example of something which is a very distributed industry. You got to go where the ore bodies are, and the circumstances of electricity production at the location of the ore body are just that. They're what it is. I think the wind and the sun are universal, but better in certain places than the other. Talking with a chap in the gold industry about a mine in an area of where there's a lot of sun, and the solar makes pretty good sense, but it might not make sense in the far north, just because obviously the winter is very dark. So I think you have to evaluate it locally. I would say that to whatever degree the costs today are not aligned, I would have great confidence that the costs in the not too distant future will be cheaper than diesel. And I think it is dependent on being able to develop using green hydrogen. That is dependent on the ability to develop renewable electricity production or an SMR, a nuclear reactor, at a mine site. And those costs are, again, going to be specific. But I think there's no question in my mind, with the cost dropping in renewables, the cost dropping in large-scale electrolysis, and if the costs drop in buying mining vehicles, as an example, which they're just at the beginning of their cost curve, then I think there's just a terrific opportunity based on green hydrogen.
Mm-hmm. And related to cost, there's a subject that comes up, the carbon credits, generally speaking, the environmental incentives that are made available to those who are engaged in this space at various stages along the process, from the producer of power, so the one who's providing the power to generate the electricity to produce the hydrogen, the manufacturers, the equipment suppliers who are making that technology available, and then the end users, the mining companies. And in theory, the provision of environmental incentives should result in the reduction of cost. And it will become a question when it comes time to paper, negotiate, settle the underlying legal documentation in connection with the projects that develop who should get those environmental incentives. So James, as the representative on the panel for the producers of the energy, do you have a view on that? Is that something, if the power producers have the benefit of the environmental incentives, would that be passed along in the form of reduced cost of electricity? What's your view on that? Who do you think should have the benefit of the environmental incentives that come along with all of this?
Yeah, I mean, it's a challenging question because everybody's lining up for that incentive. I mean, when we had the Green Panel work we did last year, this was an area we talked about quite considerably, and I don't think there's a binary answer to it. What I would say is that you have a scenario where you have what I would call a bit of an uneven carbon pricing regime across Canada. So you have provinces who have their own regime, and if they have a regime that's acceptable to the federal government, you're not subject to federal pricing. And so what I would say is you have a lot of electricity systems across Canada. Let's take Ontario as an example, where the electricity sector has invested considerable money to decarbonize to the point where we're through the phase out of coal, one of the largest climate change initiatives, as I noted earlier, in the world. And so one of the things the Green Ribbon Panel advocated was we need to look at a mechanism where, to the extent there is revenue that is collected by the federal government in carbon pricing, why not rebate some of that back to reduce people's electricity bills? Right now you have a scenario effectively where carbon taxes are collected and then they're rebated through an income tax type rebate. You know, if we want to use the electricity system to have to do more than what would be a typical role of providing electricity, if we want to use the electricity system as a foundation to decarbonize other things, we need to ensure that there's reinvestment back in that electricity system. That is obviously happening, but we also have to manage consumer bills, whether that's business bills from a competitiveness perspective. So for me, it's less about the electricity sector companies benefiting from it, because I think you need a regime like we have in Ontario, where you have really an off-taker like the IESO or the Ontario Energy Board. What I think is more important is how do consumers benefit from that? And so if we agree that, and I'm not going to pick a technology, but let's just say if we agree we need 3,000 more megawatts of clean power in Ontario to do A, B, C, and D, hydrogen may be one of those. And there's an extra cost to that. Why not invest proceeds from carbon pricing to offset consumer bills associated with that? And so I think the incentives need to be creative, but I don't think what I'm suggesting would exclude incentives for industrial people at the end of the process who may need to be incentivized to do it. If you're collecting a tax for carbon, you need to utilize that revenue to deal with the areas of increased costs that are leading to the offsets. So it's not a simple dynamic, but I think it needs far more dialogue and precision than where we are today.
Thank you for that, James. And if there are any specific questions from any of the listeners with respect
Janet,
yeah,
could I just chime in on that? I think
absolutely.
there are two things I'd love to just add to what James was saying there. I think one is the call out around, the clean fuel standard that is slated to come in Canada, being another way in which I think, particularly around hydrogen, there's a large opportunity. If you think about, an additional carbon price being put on these fuels that are carbon intensive and, targeting a 10% reduction, that number looks something like potentially up to $300 additional carbon tax beyond the, carbon tax that's scaling to $170. And so you really create a strong incentive to move away from carbon-based fuels that could precipitate a greater demand for hydrogen. The other phenomenon that I think is worth noting is several countries are exploring, tariff regimes or import regimes that essentially differentiate the carbon pricing mechanisms in the operating countries, allowing some equilibration that says, well, not every country has the same mechanisms. For all that in Canada, we don't even have consistency province by province. And, if you think globally, the variation is even more significant. And so when these sorts of mechanisms begin to come into force, there's going to be an even greater incentive to look at the potential pricing of your fuel use within your operations and ask, is there a way to mitigate this? And I think switching to hydrogen and moving to something where, whether it's green or blue or even gray today, but having the tools in order to be able to fuel switch at a later date will actually provide some mitigation of that pricing risk on a global scale.
Yep. Thank you very much, Jonathan. I think Jonathan's frozen. Nope, you're back. Those are very helpful comments. It is going to be a debate when it comes time to negotiate the project agreements, the offtake agreements. It's going to come up. It's one of the important things we have our eyes on, at least from a legal perspective, making sure that they are allocated in a way that makes most sense, given the parties at the table negotiating those arrangements. So Andrew, do you have any? Yep, Andrew, please feel free.
Oh, yeah, so I just add a footnote. It'll be very interesting, Janet, because again, totally agree with James. We need to use everything we can for the existing assets. I think when we consider very large-scale green hydrogen, which is totally different than small hydrogen uses like bus fueling stations, we're really looking at, in many places, after we've got the most out of the existing grid, as completely new investment for single-purpose activities. Because if you want to build an ammonia plant, you need a gigawatt. And the issues of providing that gigawatt dedicated for the purpose of hydrogen doesn't really play into the rest of the grids unless some overriding government authority is stopping you from actually developing green hydrogen production from renewable energy. It's an interesting dynamic because we must remember that as we grow in green hydrogen, we're going to utilize the assets that exist where we can use them, but there's no question an enormous amount of new production that does not emit fossil energy has to be made. This is perhaps, we're talking about replacing 25, perhaps 40% of the world's fossil use by hydrogen that doesn't have significant carbon footprint. We're going to see these large uses simply say, I will look after this myself for my own purpose. It's like someone putting solar panels on their roof, but it's a much bigger roof. Anyway, I just wanted to add that because I think that's an important dynamic.
Yep. Thank you very much, Andrew. The last topic that I think might be a good one for this group to discuss has to do with the topic of strategic partnerships and something that can be bankable, a project that's bankable for financing purposes. So to use an example, and I hear James when he references grid scale SMRs are being explored. There's a lot of work and research that's being done to consider when that might be feasible, when it makes sense. But just in terms of what Bruce needs in order to put a grid scale SMR into operation, from the perspective of having it available in Canada, or as an example of the type of technology that can be made available in remote locations around the world, what do you need from other strategic partners? So if there's a source of technology that can help that facility ramp. So Andrew, Hydrogen Optimized, has an electrolyzer that can arguably scale. So right now, my understanding is the largest electrolyzer in operation at the moment is a 24 megawatt PEM electrolyzer. If there's technology that becomes available so that you can ramp and scale to 200 to 400 megawatts, is that something of interest? Does that fast track the implementation, mobilization of this sort of technology in a way that's relevant to the mining industry? And what do those strategic partners need from each other in order to attract the type of financing that's available so that that project is construed as something that is bankable? So James, what is it that you would need to see from your potential? Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah. So no, there's a lot in that question. So I'll just maybe try to unpack that. It's a good question. So, I mean, the first thing I would say is, from an SMR perspective, Bruce Power is very much through our Center for Next Generation Nuclear Technology in a monitoring mode. I do not see an SMR in the near term in Bruce Power. We're very focused on our life extension program. What I would say in Ontario is Ontario Power Generation has announced a project at Darlington, and we are collaborating closely with OPG on that and recognizing they are the lead, so to speak, in terms of the next steps with SMR in Ontario. And as we get later in our life extension program successfully and watch the progress of OPG and other partners, we would make appropriate determinations. But we're, in terms of our current business plan, we don't have any plans for SMR deployment. But so just to clarify our role, and from a hydrogen perspective, one of the projects that you noted earlier through our Center for Next Generation Nuclear Technologies, we are actually undertaking a hydrogen feasibility study right now. So in all likelihood, to the extent there was ever a proponent who wanted to build a large electrolyzer facility and use the output from the Bruce Power site, we believe there could be some real good synergies there. In our current arrangement that Bruce Power has with the independent electricity system operator, we sell 100% of our electricity to them, and we want that to continue to be the case. But I think that as the province of Ontario is considering its Made in Ontario environment plan, obviously with groups like Andrew and others who are looking at various projects, we're quite keen to see how can our output fit in that. So I don't look at the future of electrolysis from nuclear as necessarily being through SMRs. I look at it as a bit technology agnostic and say it can take any electron from nuclear, whether it's an SMR, large commercial new build, our life extension project, or some of the work we're doing on our site to actually increase the output of our existing assets, which is an incredibly efficient and cost-effective way of doing that.
Andrew, have you got any reaction to that?
Well, I agree. I think getting assets to be fully utilized, whatever the low carbon, non-carbon electron is the right way to go. It's a right step. And certainly the focus is a very good idea. Where I see the sort of thing going from a strategic relationship is these mining companies, should they choose to go to green hydrogen, they will have the equivalent, they will have the green hydrogen purchasing agreement, just like an independent power producer seeks to get that. And so independent hydrogen producers will seek to deliver against the green hydrogen independent purchase agreements, which the client will have. And I think this is a completely different dynamic. When it comes to scaling of electrolyzers, I think Janet's point is well taken, because even though that 24 megawatt plant is composed of multiple smaller units, and our vision and view has been for the longest period of time, you need to actually scale in single plant modules into the hundreds of megawatts. Even we believe we can get up to 1 gigawatt. And that really brings the cost of hydrogen down. If you have to replicate small things, the cost can't come down. And I think understanding the scope and size of the hydrogen market, and particularly the large hydrogen market, which is really what's going to move the needle on climate change, your relations with strategics become who sees the benefit of this, who's going to have that green hydrogen purchase contract, and how are they going to help take this hydrogen industry forward with the right technological choices that will matter at large scale. And that's a discovery process that I think is going on in the world, because I believe there's only recently have many of these clients understood that the size of the hydrogen requirement is very big and the available electrolyzers are quite small. And I just want to point out the size of the electrolysis market for the last 20 years has been 10 to 12 megawatts a year. We're talking about something moving towards 10 to 12 gigawatts a year. And that's the issue. Ever since Jules Verne has been around, we've thought of water electrolysis, and even before then, but it's a different type of water electrolysis. What has to focus on is large scale, and large scale means hundreds of megawatts to a gigawatt in size before you replicate a plant. And that's a different game. And I think there's just an awakening, just starting to see that now.
Yep. Thank you, Andrew. It's a very exciting time for sure. And just the last point on this topic to Jonathan, I've used the phrase bankable projects, but those back-to-back electricity purchase contracts and the offtake contracts that Andrew's speaking about, I would trust that that's something that financing sources like to see in place to de-risk the project. Is that your view?
Yeah, I think, half of my job is trying to draw analogs to the renewable power industry and the way that those contracts are structured. When people talk about the efficiency of that market, what really has driven that is the ability to have power purchase agreements with, high quality off-takers or diverse baskets of off-takers that allow you to really take the risk down and then say, well, there's operating risk, and now we have, millions upon millions of hours of experience in that as well. And you're then able to say, well, what's the remaining risks? And when there are very few remaining risks, that's when, whether it's banks or markets, the people that are providing that debt get much, much happier. And that's where I think, hydrogen has a great opportunity in the same way around, a hydrogen offtake structure, the ability for an operator to have those contracts and then to begin to, chip away at all the different risk elements that, really create the function of pricing within the deals. I think the other piece that shouldn't be overlooked, particularly for green hydrogen, is the interplay with power purchasing. If you are also connected onto a grid, there is, with hydrogen and the ability to choose when you're operating, when you're taking in that power versus when you're selling in, an optimization play. And hydrogen also represents separately an opportunity on just larger scale energy storage. It's a gaseous state opportunity, or liquid state depending, way of storing that energy and utilizing capacity on the grid. And it therefore has a greater role where the contracts might get complicated when you begin to have a pick and choose arrangements, and you need to be able to provide those benefits across to the provider and still meet their needs so that they're able to run the operations that require hydrogen. But because you're able to bank, the material, there's an opportunity for it to play an efficiency role within the market, essentially taking some risk off the power side, taking some risk off the hydrogen side by leveraging the power, and finding a way to get everyone a little, more benefit in the contract, and therefore a little bit better.
Thank you, Jonathan. So now why don't we move to the Q&A portion of the webinar? We've got 10 minutes left, and I've been through some of the questions that have been asked by our guests, and I can just run through a few of them. There are some that are very relevant from the mining industry's perspective, and I think some of the detail, Andrew, some of the detail that I know you have to share in terms of the technology, the engineering behind hydrogen systems might be helpful. There's a question: does the industrial production of hydrogen have any impact on water sources? So you produce the hydrogen, you need water to produce it. And some of these mining projects are located in regions where water is scarce. What's your reaction to that question?
Again, we need to sort of study in each situation, but there's really not a lot of water required. There's about 1 liter per 1 cubic meter of hydrogen of water required. And then some of these vehicles, the fuel cell vehicle can actually produce liquid water, and you could hypothetically recycle that. And so water is a big issue, but in the context, say, places like California, which is kind of dry, I don't think anyone's really seen water supply as an issue for large-scale hydrogen deployment. But like anything, it needs to be evaluated. If you're going to have water I think the analogy we've used in the past, if you flush your toilet, you've got lots of hydrogen water to make lots of hydrogen. I think if you're taking a shower, you've got lots of water available to make hydrogen. Not that you're using the same water, but if humans can actually do that, then you're not talking about that much more water that's required.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. And there's another question. What does hydrogen do to the atmosphere? So if tomorrow all energy was producing hydrogen, would too much hydrogen be bad for the environment? How would you answer that question, Andrew?
Well, hydrogen is in our atmosphere already. I honestly can't tell you it's in the ppms or tens of ppm range. In fact, in Ontario, you're allowed to emit hydrogen to the atmosphere. I think really the more concern most people have with greater use of hydrogen is the impact on water vapor, particularly from aircraft, and what water vapor has in, I'm sorry, I don't know if it's a stratosphere or some part of the upper atmosphere, and its impact on solar rays or things. But I don't think hydrogen is not a pollutant and classified in Ontario. It's one of the few things like oxygen, nitrogen, helium, hydrogen, not a pollutant.
Yep. Thank you for that. And then another one for Andrew. To the understanding of the person who's posed this question, industry adds sulfur to both propane and natural gas to allow leak detection. So has an odorant been developed to add to hydrogen to detect leaks? So I think the question is coming from somebody who's aware that hydrogen is the lightest gas. In some respects, it's safe. If there's a leak, it dissipates, but it's flammable. So I think the question relates to, is there a way to integrate the use of hydrogen into operation so that it can be used in a safe way? Is adding something that detects a leak a way in which to mitigate the risk?
So mercaptants are used with natural gas and other fuels, propane. Got to remember, these fuels are heavier than air, and they'll spread around looking for a source of ignition. Hydrogen, the one thing we can guarantee about it, it will go up and straight up and fast. And that's frankly where sensors are required in any enclosed environment to detect the presence of hydrogen and then be able to have a reaction plan to it. I think one of the issues would be if you add a mercaptant to hydrogen, then put the hydrogen in a fuel cell, the people that make the fuel cells are not going to be very happy. I think there is risk with hydrogen. If you do have a leak and it catches, it can be like a torch, and it will be an invisible torch. I think that's a legitimate risk. There are, I think they're called infrared monitors that can pick that up. And so hydrogen's been designed, equipment has been designed to handle this all through the world in every circumstance. I don't really see any kind of industrial process in mining or in the chemical process industry that's going to have a difficulty with it. There's technologies to deal with this. They have to be dealt with. It has to be safe.
Thank you, Andrew. And there's another question that's been asked that I think would be one Jonathan can handle. The question relates to whether going green with hydrogen is financially sound for a company. Would using green technology require heavy investment for companies? If yes, how would they address the challenges of the cost when non-green technologies are much cheaper? So there are a few things in there, but Jonathan, have you got a reaction to that question?
Yeah, I think, as in most things, the question really comes down to life cycle cost rather than point in time. Depending on where your commodity is being sold and, where pricing is for carbon and the trajectory of that pricing, it's one where you really do need to ask, is this going to make financial sense in the next 3 years, in the next 5 years versus today? And across the lifetime of those assets, particularly given a lot of these are assets that are going to be used for a prolonged period of time, particularly the infrastructure as you're standing up an operation, it really can be something where if you were, I'll use an example, if you were operating in Canada and you were banking on a $30 price of carbon for the next 10 years, you're over the last 6 months finding yourself not very happy with the decisions that you made on that basis. And so one question really is the risk that you're taking on, invisibly potentially, of future regulatory or pricing mechanisms. And then also the risk that you take on devaluation of your product by those that have an environmental footprint requirement in their operations as well that may or may not be able to be mitigated. And if you essentially have to pay for a carbon offset to make your product comparable, that's going to also be a cost. And so I think the problem becomes that there's the intransparency of what the future looks like, and you have to be able to risk weight those decisions in order to have things make sense.
Thank you, Jonathan. And we've got about 3 minutes left, which I think is enough time for James to offer his reaction to a question that's come. And it relates to the question of storage. So hydrogen gas is very flexible because it can be stored. So once it's produced using electricity, it can be stored. And this particular guest is flagging good points raised by Jonathan with respect to, I think we were talking about bankability at the time. It's essentially about the energy mix that hydrogen may be part of. So considering that the bankability of many energy projects is driven by the levelized cost of electricity, where do you believe we are heading re-storage? With specific reference to type 1 to 4 storage costs, is there a percentage to allocate towards storage in connection with the overall capex of a hydrogen plant? So there's a lot in there, James, but just on the general topic of storage, where do you see things going? Do you see that playing an important role?
I mean, I look at storage as it's an enabler to manage your supply mix. So I don't look at it as so much as a, hey, let's block off 10% of the supply mix for storage. I look at it and say, develop a clean electricity system, consider your industries and uses, and then you will always have a mismatch of assets to some degree. You will have, our nuclear at Bruce Power is flexible. There's some nuclear that isn't. You have intermittent wind. You may have limited natural gas use or hydroelectric use. And then you need to think about what are the technologies to optimize that. So, I think storage is something. I don't look at hydrogen as storage. I look at hydrogen as a secondary energy product. And I know that may not jive with sort of the general thinking, but versus the storage discussion, I think is more about how do you optimize and utilize those assets. And I think system operators need to create the right incentives for that. You look at people look at pump storage projects. That's a really good storage. So it really depends on location, as Andrew says, the sector you're dealing in, and but obviously storage has to, and I think is part of it. In terms of, you talk about the storage of hydrogen as a compressed gas. I mean, look, we got a fantastic oil and gas sector in Canada. Those are the folks we need to engage in this. They deal with this all the time. There's nothing new here, and that's a great opportunity for the oil and gas sector as they continue to hopefully be successful in oil and natural gas as well.
Yeah, those are great points, James. Thanks very much. We've hit 2:30, which is the time when the webinar ends. So just in closing, I'd like to thank our panelists very much for your time and effort to contribute to the discussion. And I'd like to thank those in attendance for their interest in the topic.